Friday nights at our house were always the same. Dinner at 6:30, the kids squabbling over whose turn it was to set the table, and a neighbor or two joining us. It had become a bit of a tradition over the years, a way to wind down after a long week and stay connected with the community. This Friday, it was Carl again. He lived next door for 2 years and was one of those guys who seemed to have endless time for barbecues, small talk, and helping out with odd jobs. Carl always brought wine and terrible jokes, but the kids liked him, and Mia seemed to like him too. That night, as I sat at the head of the table carving the roast, I noticed something strange. Carl was his usual loud self, laughing at his own jokes, but it was Mia who caught my attention. She was glowing in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, her laughter spilling over at things that weren't even funny. I tried to brush it off. After all, I'd been married to Mia for 14 years. We had 2 great kids, a solid life. She was probably just in a good mood. But when Carl leaned over to whisper something in her ear, and she swatted his arm with that playful, flirty laugh of hers, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Jealousy. I didn't say anything, but my eyes were locked on them now, searching for clues I wasn't even sure existed. I noticed the way her hand lingered on Carl's arm a second too long when he passed her the wine. The way Carl's gaze drifted to her neckline when he thought no one was looking. The kids were oblivious, chatting about school and arguing over the last piece of bread, but I couldn't focus on anything they were saying. My stomach churned as I caught another look between Carl and Mia, quick, fleeting, but loaded with something I didn't want to name. After dinner, Mia stood to clear the plates, and Carl immediately offered to help. "You don't have to," she said, her voice light and cheerful, but she didn't stop him when he followed her into the kitchen. I stayed seated, my fork resting on the edge of my plate. The kids ran off to the living room, leaving me alone at the table. From where I sat, I could hear muffled voices coming from the kitchen. "Are you sure it's safe?" Carl's voice. "It's fine," Mia replied quickly. "He has no idea." I froze. My chest tightened as those words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stood, careful not to make a sound, and moved closer to the kitchen. I couldn't see them, but their voices carried just enough for me to hear. "You worry too much," Mia said, her tone breezy. "Can you blame me?" Carl shot back, laughing softly. I stepped back into the dining room, my heart pounding. My mind raced, grasping at explanations that wouldn't send my world spiraling. Maybe they were talking about something innocent. Maybe I'd misheard. Or maybe not. When Mia and Carl came back into the dining room with dessert, I plastered a smile on my face. But every bite of pie tasted like ash, and every laugh I forced out felt hollow. That night, after Carl left and the kids were asleep, I lay in bed next to Mia, staring at the ceiling. She fell asleep quickly, as if nothing was wrong, her soft breathing filling the room. I couldn't stop replaying the evening in my head. The looks, the whispers, the words that I couldn't unhear. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I needed to know the truth. The next day, I started paying closer attention. Mia's phone was always face down on the counter, and she spent more time on it than usual. She laughed at texts she never showed me and brushed off my casual questions about her day. She didn't notice when I started watching her more carefully. It wasn't long before I got my first piece of evidence. One evening, while she was in the shower, she left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. I'd never been the type to snoop, but something pushed me forward. At first, everything seemed normal. Messages with her mom, a group chat for the kids' school, and some Pinterest notifications. But then I saw the text with Carl. They started harmless enough. Jokes, memes, and a lot of talk about neighborhood events. But as I scrolled further back, the tone shifted. "Carl, can't stop thinking about last night. You looked incredible." "Mia, you're too much. I probably shouldn't have stayed so late." "Carl, you should have stayed longer." I felt sick. I couldn't keep scrolling. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it, my hands trembling. That night, I didn't say a word. I didn't want her to know I suspected anything, not yet. The next day, while she was at work, I installed a couple of small cameras around the house. One in the living room, another in the kitchen. Nothing too obvious. It didn't take long for the cameras to pay off. Just 2 days later, I watched from my phone as Carl walked into our house while I was at work. They didn't even bother hiding it. They sat close together on the couch, laughing, leaning into each other. And then he kissed her. The image burned into my mind as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. I wanted to confront them right then, to throw Carl out of my house and demand answers from Mia. But I stopped myself. This wasn't enough. Not yet. I needed to be smart. If they thought they could get away with this, they had no idea who they were dealing with. And so, I began planning. I spent the next few days walking around in a fog. Everything felt wrong. When Mia spoke to me, her voice grated against my nerves, though I forced a smile. When she laughed with the kids or kissed me goodnight, I felt this strange mixture of anger and sadness, like I'd lost something without even realizing it. I'd never been good at hiding my emotions, but I had to keep it together. She couldn't know I was onto her. Not yet. The cameras had given me what I needed to confirm my worst fears, but they also opened the floodgates. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. How long had this been going on? How many times had Carl walked through my door, smiling and shaking my hand, while sneaking around behind my back? And Mia, God, Mia. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman I'd shared my life with, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone. How could she do this? How could she look me in the eye every day and pretend like everything was fine? I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand the full extent of their betrayal before I made my move. That's when I decided to take things a step further. On Wednesday afternoon, while Mia was at work and the kids were at school, I installed a GPS tracker under her car. It was small, easy to conceal, and connected to an app on my phone. I told myself it was the only way to be sure, though part of me hated what I was doing. But then I thought about Carl in my living room, laughing with my kids, leaning in to kiss my wife. The guilt melted away. I wasn't the bad guy here. That night, Mia was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone while we watched TV. At least, I was pretending to watch TV. She was my real focus. "What's your weekend looking like?" I asked casually, keeping my eyes on the screen. She barely looked up. "I've got the spa on Saturday, remember?" "Right. The spa. That's nice," I said, keeping my tone light. "Which one?" She hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "The one downtown. Same as always." A lie. I knew for a fact she wasn't going to any spa. That's when I decided to test her. "Maybe I'll swing by when you're done," I said. "We can grab lunch." Her reaction was immediate. Her head snapped up, her eyes darting to mine for a fraction of a second before she forced a smile. "Oh, you don't have to do that. I'll probably be wiped out afterward. You know how those massages can be?" I nodded, pretending to drop the subject, but inside, I felt the anger simmering again. By Friday evening, I had everything in place. The cameras, the GPS tracker, even a program on her phone that let me see her messages in real time. It was just a matter of waiting. Saturday morning, Mia kissed me on the cheek before heading out the door. "Don't forget about dinner tonight," she said with a smile, grabbing her bag. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, watching as she walked to her car. I waited until she was out of the driveway before pulling out my phone and opening the GPS app. Sure enough, her car wasn't headed toward any spa. It was moving in the opposite direction, straight toward a motel on the outskirts of town. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to follow her immediately. But I knew better than to rush in blind. I needed to stay calm, to see this through. The GPS tracker showed her car stopping in the motel parking lot. Moments later, the doorbell camera on our house app pinged. I opened the feed and saw Carl walking up to her car. He leaned in through the window, grinning like a man who'd just hit the jackpot, before getting into the passenger seat. I watched the GPS signal move again, this time to a different location, a house on the far side of town. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I logged into the app that controlled the cameras in my house, checking to make sure everything was still working. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, all of it was ready. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. Not yet. But it was going to be a turning point. Mia came home late that afternoon, just in time to get ready for dinner. She seemed lighter, happier, as if she'd just returned from an actual spa day. "How was it?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Relaxing," she said, her voice warm. "Exactly what I needed." I nodded, smiling back at her. She had no idea that I knew exactly where she'd been. By the time Carl showed up for dinner, I had already decided how this was going to go. We sat at the table, the kids chatting away about school while Carl cracked jokes that weren't funny. Mia laughed like they were the funniest thing she'd ever heard. I played along, asking Carl about his latest work project and complimenting Mia on the meal. Everything was perfectly normal on the surface, but inside, I was already planning my next move. When Carl left that night, I walked him to the door like always. He clapped me on the back, flashing his easy grin, and said, "Thanks for having me over, man." "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. As he walked down the driveway, I couldn't help but think about what was coming. He had no idea what I was about to do. Neither did Mia. I watched her clean up the table, humming to herself like everything was fine. She thought she was safe. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment Mia left, I grabbed my phone and opened the GPS tracking app. Her car, a silver sedan she swore was just practical, was headed straight for the outskirts of town. The spot she claimed to be visiting was downtown, nowhere near where she was actually going. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee as the blue on the screen made its slow journey to a rundown motel on Route 8. The coffee tasted bitter, or maybe it was just the knot of anger and betrayal twisting in my stomach. Her car stopped. A few moments later, the screen flashed an alert from the doorbell camera. Carl. He swaggered into view, dressed in a casual button-down and jeans like it was just another Saturday morning. He didn't even bother to look around for neighbors or anyone who might recognize him. I watched as he leaned through the driver's window, grinning like he owned the world. Mia's hand reached out, resting briefly on his shoulder before he got into the passenger seat. My grip tightened around the phone, but I didn't react. I couldn't. Not yet. The GPS tracker showed the car leaving the motel and heading into a residential area on the far side of town. I didn't recognize the address, but I had a feeling it wasn't somewhere either of them wanted me to know about. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the surge of rage boiling in my chest. I wasn't going to blow up. That was what they'd expect. I needed them to feel secure, to keep thinking they were in control. I logged into my camera system and double-checked that everything was operational. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, every angle of the house was covered. I had spent the past week preparing for this moment, and now everything was set. Mia came home later than usual, just as I had expected. She walked through the door with a smile plastered across her face, setting her bag down on the counter like she had just returned from an ordinary spa day. "How was your morning?" I asked casually from my spot on the couch. "Great," she replied, her tone bright. "So relaxing." "I needed that." I nodded, pretending to focus on the TV. "Glad you enjoyed yourself." She kissed me on the top of the head and headed upstairs to shower, completely unaware that I had been tracking her every move. By the time dinner rolled around, I was ready. The table was set, the kids were excited, and Mia was bustling around the kitchen with her usual energy. She wore a simple but flattering dress, the kind she usually saved for special occasions. Carl arrived a few minutes late, flashing his signature grin as he stepped through the door. "Sorry, traffic was a nightmare," he said, holding up a bottle of wine. "No worries," I replied, clapping him on the back. "Glad you made it." He handed the bottle to Mia, who beamed at him in a way that made my stomach churn, but I said nothing, keeping my tone light and friendly. Dinner started out just like any other. The kids were talking over each other. Mia was fussing about whether the potatoes were cooked properly, and Carl was cracking his usual jokes. But beneath the surface, my mind was racing. I watched their interactions carefully, noticing every subtle glance, every touch that lingered just a second too long. It was infuriating to see it happen right in front of me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the moment to strike. Not yet. After dinner, Carl and Mia moved into the kitchen to clean up while I stayed at the table with the kids. I could hear their muffled voices over the clatter of dishes. "Think he suspects anything?" Carl asked in a low voice. Mia laughed softly. "Not a chance. He's completely clueless." The words cut deeper than I expected. I had always prided myself on being sharp, on knowing everything about my family. And here they were, treating me like a fool. I didn't move. I didn't react. I just sat there, smiling at my daughter's story about her art project while my wife and her lover schemed in my kitchen. When Carl finally left, I walked him to the door, just like I always did. "Thanks for coming," I said, shaking his hand. "Anytime," he replied, his grin as smug as ever. As he walked down the driveway, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. He thought he had gotten away with it. They both did. They had no idea what was coming. That night, after the kids were asleep and Mia was upstairs, I sat in the living room and pulled out my phone. I opened the footage from the cameras I had hidden in the house, watching as Carl leaned in to kiss Mia in the kitchen when he thought no one was looking. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last bit of evidence I needed. I stayed up late into the night, organizing everything: texts, GPS data, video clips. By the time I was done, I had a full arsenal of proof. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I set the trap. They won't see it coming. Sunday morning dawned quiet and uneventful, but my mind was anything but. I had spent hours the night before assembling everything: the texts, the GPS logs, and, most damning of all, the video footage from my cameras. It was all neatly saved and organized on a flash drive, ready for what I had planned. The trap was set. Mia woke up cheerful, her usual Sunday morning self. She cooked breakfast for the kids, humming a little tune under her breath. The way she smiled and acted like everything was normal made my stomach churn, but I played along. "Big day today?" I said casually, sipping my coffee at the kitchen table. "Oh," she asked, turning to me with a curious look. I nodded. "I've invited a few people over for dinner tonight. Just a little get-together with the neighbors. Carl and Lisa will be there, of course." Her face faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly, flashing me a bright smile. "That's nice. I'll make something special." "Perfect," I said, hiding the bitterness in my voice. The day passed slowly. Mia spent most of it preparing for dinner, chopping vegetables and marinating meat, while I stayed out of her way. The kids were excited about having company over, chattering about what games they'd play after dinner. Around 5 p.m., I slipped out of the house and drove to Carl's place under the guise of running an errand. I knocked on his door, and he opened it with his usual smirk. "James, what's up?" "Hey, just wanted to let you know we're starting dinner around 6. Lisa's coming too, right?" "Yeah, of course," he said, still grinning like the bastard he was. I nodded. "Great. Looking forward to it." He had no idea that I knew everything. By the time the guests arrived, the house was immaculate. Mia had outdone herself, setting the table with her best plates and lighting candles for ambience. She even wore a dress she hadn't pulled out in years, a deep red one that made her look stunning. It was a deliberate choice, I realized. She wasn't dressing up for me. Carl and Lisa arrived first. He waltzed in with a bottle of wine in hand, the perfect picture of a friendly neighbor. Mia greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and for the first time, I noticed a flicker of nervousness in her demeanor. "Lisa, great to see you," I said warmly, giving Carl's wife a quick hug. Lisa smiled, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. A few other neighbors trickled in after that: Karen and Jeff from down the block, and Mark, a guy from work who I knew had a thing for drama. I made sure the audience was carefully chosen. Dinner started out like any other. The kids laughed and argued over whose turn it was to pass the bread, and the adults chatted about mundane neighborhood gossip. I sat at the head of the table, smiling and nodding along, waiting for the perfect moment. Carl was in his element, cracking jokes and making everyone laugh, while Mia played the perfect hostess. But I noticed the way her eyes darted to him when she thought no one was looking, the way her hand lingered on his when she passed him the butter. It was almost laughable how obvious they were. After dessert, I stood up, clinking my glass to get everyone's attention. "Before we wrap up the evening," I began, my voice calm and steady, "I'd like to share something with you all." Mia looked at me curiously, her head tilting slightly. Carl leaned back in his chair, oblivious as ever. I pulled out my laptop, placing it on the table. The room grew quiet as everyone watched me. "I've been working on a little project lately," I said, opening a folder on the screen, "and I thought tonight would be the perfect time to share it." The first video clip began playing. It was silent at first, grainy footage of our living room. But then Carl walked into the frame, grinning as he sat next to Mia on the couch. Mia's face turned pale, her smile vanishing in an instant. What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I let the video play. It was short, only a few seconds long, but it showed everything I needed it to. Carl leaning in, Mia laughing nervously, and then the kiss. The room erupted. Lisa's face twisted in shock and fury as she turned to Carl. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Carl shot to his feet. "James, what are you doing?" "Just sharing the truth," I said calmly, closing the laptop. Mia stood, her hands shaking. "James, please, let me explain." "Oh, don't worry." I cut her off. "I have more." I pulled a stack of printed screenshots from the folder next to my plate. Texts between Mia and Carl, each one more damning than the last. I handed them to Lisa, who snatched them from my hand. Her eyes scanned the pages, her hands trembling. "You son of a bitch," she spat, shoving them at Carl. "How could you?" "Mia," I said, turning to my wife. "Care to explain to the group how long this has been going on?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. The room was chaos. Lisa stormed out, shouting at Carl to never come home again. The neighbors whispered furiously among themselves, some shooting Mia disgusted looks. And I stood there, watching it all unfold with a strange sense of satisfaction. They thought they were untouchable, that I was too blind, too stupid to notice. But now, everyone knew the truth. And I wasn't done yet. The chaos in the dining room was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Lisa was screaming at Carl. The neighbors sat frozen with their mouths open, and Mia looked like her world had just collapsed. "Lisa, please. It's not what you think." Carl stammered, his voice cracking. Lisa's face was a mask of fury as she held up one of the text messages I'd printed. "I can't wait to feel your hands on me again." "Really, Carl? That's not what I think." She shoved the papers into his chest, then turned to me. "How long have you known about this?" "Long enough," I said, my voice calm. Mia stood shakily, her eyes darting between me and the laptop like she was looking for a way out. "James, please, let me explain." I held up a hand to silence her. "Not now, Mia. You'll get your chance." "Chance for what?" Lisa cut in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "To explain why she's been screwing my husband?" Mia's face crumpled, and she opened her mouth. But before she could say a word, a voice from the other side of the table cut through the noise. "Wait, are we seriously going to ignore the fact that Mia and Carl aren't the only ones in this mess?" Everyone turned to Jake, one of the neighbors I'd invited. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, looking entirely too calm for the situation. "What the hell are you talking about, Jake?" I asked, my patience hanging by a thread. Jake shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "I mean, come on, James. You don't really think Mia's just been with Carl, do you?" The room went deathly quiet. "What?" Mia's voice was barely audible, but her expression betrayed her guilt. Jake raised his eyebrows. "You really want me to say it, Mia? Should I tell James about last summer? Or are you going to come clean?" My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at her. What is he talking about? Mia's face was pale, her lips trembling as she shook her head. "Jake's lying. He's trying to stir things up." "Lying?" Jake laughed. "Really? That's what you're going with? Fine. I'll remind you." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. 4th of July. My pool party. You said James was out of town for work. Remember? A gasp went through the room. Mia's shoulders slumped, and she looked like she might collapse. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "Is this true?" I asked, my voice low. She shook her head, but the guilt in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. "It was a mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking. "A mistake." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in my own ears. "A mistake? How many mistakes are we talking about, Mia? Because it sounds like Carl wasn't the first." Jake leaned back, looking pleased with himself. "Don't worry, James. I'm not the only one she's been cozy with. You might want to ask around the neighborhood." That was it. The final straw. I slammed my hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Enough." My voice echoed through the room, silencing even Lisa, who had been mid-rant at Carl. I turned to Mia, who was now sobbing into her hands. I gave you everything, I said, my voice trembling with anger. I trusted you. I built a life with you. And this is what you do? You humiliate me in front of my friends, my family, my kids? James, please, she begged, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I made a mistake, but I love you. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You don't love me. You love getting away with it. I turned to the rest of the room. Lisa, I'm sorry you had to find out like this, but I think it's clear we've both been played for fools. Lisa nodded, her eyes red and puffy. You're right. And you, she pointed a trembling finger at Carl. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. Carl tried to speak, but Lisa wasn't interested. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Jake stood, smirking. Well, this has been fun, but I think my work here is done. He winked at Mia before strolling toward the door, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. The other neighbors murmured awkward goodbyes, clearly eager to escape the tension. Within minutes, the house was empty, save for Mia and me. I stood at the head of the table, staring at her as she sat slumped in her chair, her face streaked with tears. What now? She whispered. What now? I repeated, my voice cold. What happens now is that you pack your things and leave. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'll be filing for divorce first thing tomorrow. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. James, no. Please, don't do this. We can fix this. There's nothing left to fix, I interrupted. You made your choices, Mia, and now you get to live with them. She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. I turned away, walking upstairs without another word. This wasn't just the end of our marriage. This was the end of the life I thought I knew. And somehow, that felt like freedom. The house was silent after Mia's breakdown, but my mind wasn't. Sleep didn't come that night. Not that I expected it to. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how much of my life had been a lie. Every kiss, every late-night laugh, every promise she'd made. It was all tainted now. By the time the sun rose, I had already decided on my next move. Filing for divorce wasn't enough. Mia and Carl had disrespected me in my own home, in front of my kids, and now everyone knew. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. But first, I had to protect my children. Mia was still in the guest room when I came downstairs. She had barricaded herself there after our confrontation, sobbing so loudly I'm sure the neighbors heard her. I didn't care. The kids were eating breakfast, oblivious to the storm brewing between their parents. Emma was talking about a project for school, and Jake was half listening while scrolling on his tablet. I sat down at the table, forcing a smile. Big day at school today? I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Yeah, Emma said, her mouth full of cereal. We're doing the volcano thing in science class. Jake smirked. You mean the experiment where someone always makes a mess? Sounds fun. They were too young to understand what was happening, and I intended to keep it that way, at least for now. I kissed them both on the head before they left for school, watching as the bus pulled away. As soon as they were gone, my smile dropped. It was time. Mia was in the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes puffy from crying. She didn't look at me as I walked in. We need to talk, I said, my voice cold. She flinched but didn't argue. I sat down at the table, sliding a folder across to her. Divorce papers, I said simply. Her eyes widened as she stared at the folder, her hands trembling. James, please don't do this. We can go to therapy, fix things. No. I cut her off, my tone sharp. This isn't fixable, Mia. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we built together. And now, you're going to face the consequences. She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when I slid a second piece of paper across the table. This is an agreement, I said. You'll sign over full custody of the kids to me. I'll let you see them, but it'll be on my terms. I'm not letting you drag them into your mess. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. You can't do this. I'm their mother. Some mother. I snapped, my voice rising. You were too busy sneaking around with Carl to think about them. Did you even consider what this would do to them if they found out? She sobbed harder, her hands clutching the folder like it might burn her. I stood, leaning across the table. Sign the papers, Mia, or I'll make sure every sordid detail of your affair comes out in court. By the afternoon, the papers were signed. Mia didn't argue anymore. She knew she had no ground to stand on. I'd already spoken to my lawyer, and with all the evidence I had, the divorce would be swift and clean. But Carl wasn't getting off that easily. I spent the rest of the day preparing the next phase of my plan. Carl had been careful to keep his affair quiet, but he hadn't accounted for someone like me. I dug through the messages I'd collected and found exactly what I was looking for. Evidence that Carl had used work hours to meet up with Mia. That night, I sent an anonymous email to Carl's boss. Attached were screenshots of his messages, along with timestamps and GPS data that proved he'd been misusing company time. It didn't take long to get a response. By Monday morning, Carl was unemployed. Lisa, however, deserved the full truth. I sent her the same email, along with a note apologizing for how everything had unfolded at dinner. She called me later that day, her voice shaky but grateful. "I'm filing for divorce," she said firmly. "I'm not letting him take me for a fool any longer." "Good," I replied. "He doesn't deserve you." Mia stayed in the guest room for the next few days, only coming out to eat or talk to the kids. She avoided me completely, which was fine. I didn't have anything left to say to her. The kids started asking questions, of course. Emma wanted to know why her mom wasn't sleeping in the same room as me, and Jake noticed how quiet things had gotten. I told them we were having grown-up problems and that they didn't need to worry. For now, that was enough. By the end of the week, Mia had packed her things and left. She moved in with her parents, who were just as disgusted by her actions as I was. I kept the house, along with full custody of the kids. But I wasn't done. Carl thought he could move on after losing his job, but I made sure that every mutual friend we had knew exactly what he'd done. The texts, the photos, the videos, I sent it all to our neighborhood group chat. The fallout was swift. Carl's reputation was in shreds, and Lisa's divorce lawyer made sure he lost even more than I did. The house felt quieter after everything settled. The kids adjusted to the new normal quickly, though I could tell they missed having their mom around. I told myself that was okay. Mia could still be in their lives, but she wouldn't be in mine. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I sat on the couch that night, scrolling through my phone, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. I had gotten my revenge, but at what cost? Still, one thing was certain. Mia and Carl thought they could humiliate me and get away with it. They were wrong. It had been 3 weeks since Mia moved out. The house felt different, quieter, heavier in a way that didn't come from the silence. The kids were adjusting well enough, but Emma had stopped asking when her mom was coming back, and Jake was pulling away, retreating into video games and headphones. I couldn't blame them. Everything had shifted. The family we built was shattered, and while the pieces still existed, they didn't fit together anymore. I sat at the dining room table one evening, staring at the laptop that had started it all. I hadn't touched it since that disastrous dinner, though the files were still there. The texts, the videos, the proof of every lie Mia and Carl had spun. Part of me wanted to delete them, to wipe the slate clean and move on. But another part of me, the part that had held the reins through all of this, wouldn't let go. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Lisa standing on the porch. She looked different, stronger, somehow. Her makeup was gone, her face bare, and her expression was calm. "Hi," she said, holding up a bottle of wine. "I thought maybe you could use this." "I know I can." I hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." We sat on the back porch, sipping wine and staring into the quiet night. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my chest start to ease. "Carl's living in his brother's basement," Lisa said with a small, bitter smile. "I served him with the papers 2 days ago." "Good," I replied. "He deserves worse." Lisa nodded, taking another sip of wine. "And Mia? How's she holding up?" "She's at her parents' house," I said, "still calling me every day, trying to apologize, asking to see the kids." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "And And I don't care, I said firmly. I'll let her see the kids when they're ready, but she's out of my life for good. Lisa studied me for a moment, then raised her glass. To endings, she said. To endings, I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. After Lisa left, I sat outside for a long time, staring at the stars and thinking about the choices that had led me here. The pain was still there, sharp and fresh, but there was something else now, a faint, unfamiliar feeling that I could only describe as relief. The chaos was over. The lies, the betrayal, the anger. It had all burned itself out, leaving behind something raw but real. The next morning, Mia called again. "James, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I just want to see the kids. I need to make this right." I paused, the phone heavy in my hand. "Mia," I said, my tone cold but calm, "this isn't about making things right for you. It's about what's best for them. And right now, they need stability. Not more lies, not more excuses." She sniffled, her voice trembling. I love them so much. Please," I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'll talk to them, but I'm not making any promises." "Thank you," she whispered. I hung up, staring at the phone for a moment before setting it down. That afternoon, I sat Emma and Jake down in the living room. "Mom wants to see you," I said carefully, watching their faces. "But only if you're ready." Emma looked at me, her eyes wide. "Do I have to?" "No," I said firmly. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Jake frowned, his gaze fixed on the floor. Why does she even want to see us now? She didn't care before. The bitterness in his voice caught me off guard, but I nodded. "I think she realizes what she's lost," I said softly. "But that doesn't mean you owe her anything." They both nodded, and I left it at that. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly started to settle into something resembling normalcy. I focused on the kids, on work, on rebuilding the pieces of my life that Mia's betrayal had shattered. Carl was a ghost in the neighborhood, barely seen except for the occasional late-night trip to his brother's house. Lisa and I crossed paths now and then, sharing polite nods and small talk. And Mia? She stayed at her parents' house, calling less frequently as the weeks went by. One evening, as I was tucking Emma into bed, she looked up at me with wide, questioning eyes. "Dad?" "Yeah, sweetheart. Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "You just seem sad sometimes." I smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I'm okay," I said softly. "I've got you and Jake. That's all I need." She smiled back, her eyelids growing heavy. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, sweetheart." Later that night, as I sat alone in the living room, I thought about her question. Was I okay? Maybe not yet, but I would be. For the first time in weeks, I felt something new, a faint flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start.